Do you know the language levels A1, B2, C1, and so on? And what they mean? These are the levels within the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or CEFR for short. Oh, and hi, I'm Chris, a linguist and language teacher. I usually make my videos in German, but this topic is so important that I'm making a version in English. I'll link the German one up here in case you want to switch. But let's jump right in. How many levels are there? Well, it's hard to say exactly how many levels there are because each level can be divided in 2 or more sub-levels. Language competence and language use is usually categorized in 3 levels: elementary, A, independent, B, and competent, C. These levels are usually divided into 2, so that we have A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2, with A1 being the lowest level and C2 being the highest level. Although A1 is the lowest level, it's not nothing. At A1, you'll be able to use and understand familiar, everyday expressions and simple sentences. This means that if you can't speak any German, then you're not at the A1 level. You're before that. Sometimes we call this A0. And although C2 is the highest level, this doesn't mean that you have nothing left to learn or that you're perfect. But you will be able to understand practically everything you hear or read without much difficulty. You'll also be able to express yourself very fluently, spontaneously, and precisely. You'll also have to be able to express subtle differences and nuances in meaning. You can still have an accent, though. Other minor difficulties with word order or usage of articles can still come up at the C2 level. It's also important to know that these levels are sometimes subdivided even further into 2 or 3 or even 4 sub-levels, especially when it comes to the teaching context. So there will sometimes not only be an A1 course, but there will be an A1.1, A1.2, A1.3, or even A1.4 that you would need to take in order to have learned all of the information that may be needed to say you've reached the A1 level. And does this apply to all languages? CEFR is a model that was created in Europe with EU languages in mind in order to quantify language levels for these specific languages. Over time, however, it's become more and more widespread. This means that the system is now used for non-European languages and even outside of Europe. Nevertheless, some countries or some languages may use other systems. I know from my own experience that when I learned German in my home country, I hadn't heard of all of this. This is not how I referred to my level of German in school or at university. But I think this is getting more and more common in the US and many other countries. And how long does each level take? No matter what answers you get to this question, they're only estimates. There are so many factors at play, like what language you're learning, what other languages you know, if you have experience with learning foreign languages, and so much more. But let's look at what the Goethe Institute has to say about how long they think it takes to learn German. For A1, they expect you to have gone through between 60 and 150 hours of lessons. Depending on how often and for how long you meet each week, this could be 1 to 2 semesters at university or 1 to 3 months at a language school, for example. For A2, they expect you to have had between 150 and 260 hours of lessons since you started the learning process. For B1, you'd need between 260 and 490 hours in total. For B2, you'll need between 450 and 600 hours of lessons. And for C1, you're expected to have spent between 600 and 750 hours in class. Whereas for C2, you're expected to have had over 750 hours of lessons since you started the language. But it could take even longer. It's important to note that these figures refer to classroom time. So you're expected, of course, to also spend time on homework or just studying what you've learned outside of the classroom. And those hours are not even included in all of that, which I just went through. That means that the number of hours is not the amount of time that you've spent with the language. That number would be much higher. But to break it down, if you're studying enough outside of class, you could expect the levels A1 and A2 to each take about half a year. B1 often takes a bit longer, so I'd factor in about 9 months for that, and we'll say a whole year for B2. This means that from complete beginner to B2, I would expect someone to spend between 2 and 4 years, meaning that I would factor in a minimum of a half a year per level. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what about C1 and C2? I find these levels to be much more variable because it depends on really how much time you're spending with the language, because these levels require much better feeling for the language. So if you're spending a lot of time in the real world using the language, these won't be too hard. But if you're not doing that, this is going to take a while. And what can influence your speed? So many factors can lengthen or shorten the time that you will need. Your first language has a big impact on how quickly you will learn a foreign language. You may learn the language faster if your first language is similar. This means related, but even unrelated languages can be helpful if they have specific sounds that are also in your target language, or if specific grammatical constructions are similar in both languages, for example. However, this is not only the case with your first language. This can apply to any other language you've already learned. All of your language learning experience can help you learn a new language faster and more effectively. Your entire language learning experience can help you learn a new language faster and more effectively. Having already learned any language in the past can help you learn a new language more efficiently as well. Knowing how you personally learn vocabulary or grammar best can really help you when you're learning a new language. Regardless, learning a language will take time. This means that staying consistent is really, really important. So if you take a long break, then it may take you longer to learn the language. Learning multiple languages at the same time can also lead to you being less focused and spending less time on the specific language, which will slow your progress. Anything that reduces your concentration will also slow your progress down. And if you're learning in a class, then the size of the class, the size of the group, as well as your teacher's methods will also impact how efficiently you learn the language. In general, you should try to speak, read, listen, write, discuss, and summarize as much as possible in and outside the classroom. If you're learning in a group, then it could also be beneficial to additionally take individual lessons, or just generally use the language as much as you can outside of class. And honestly, try to be active in class. You want to really use the language, not just sit in the classroom and hope that it finds its way into your brain. And don't avoid things just because you're unsure. That's how you learn. Now, to a slightly different but very important topic, it's your brain that's learning the language. So anything that's good for your brain will help you learn faster, and anything that's bad for your brain will make you learn slower. So you should try to sleep enough, reduce your stress, and generally just lead a healthy life if you want to learn more quickly. But how do I know which class I should take? Classes are named according to the level that should be reached at the end of the class. That's why classes are never called A0, because that doesn't need to be the goal for the end of a class, because everyone already has that. You kind of start at A0. You want to have reached A1 or at least A1.1, so the beginner class will be called accordingly, A1 or A1.1, depending. This means that you will have ideally already reached the level that's directly before the level of the name of the class. So if you want to take a B2 course, then it's important that you're already at about the B1 level. And language tests are different from language classes. You take the test for exactly your level. The aim of the test is to check whether or not you've really reached that level. That's why there's no A0 test either, because you don't need to know anything to be at the A0 level, so this cannot be tested. However, if you've already taken an A1 class or you've learned the material yourself, you could take an A1 test. And if you pass the A1 test, that's a good indication that you're ready for an A2 or A2.1 class. And what goal should you set? In the short term, generally just the next level. You should shoot to have a better level than you have today. But it may be helpful to have an end goal in mind so you know what you're working towards. Your goal doesn't have to be C2. It doesn't have to be C1 or B2 either. You have to take a moment to truly reflect. What do you need to achieve in this specific language? What do you need for your job or your family? B2 or C1 are sufficient for most jobs. If you only need the language for shopping or dealing with bureaucracy once a year, once every couple years, you may only need B1. It really varies from person to person. I personally had the goal of reaching C1 for a long time, but through my studies and working as a German teacher, I kind of woke up one day and realized I'd already achieved C2. This means that goals can change over time, and sometimes you reach a further goal without having even really noticed it. Or the other way around, it could be that you are achieving everything in your life that you need from the language before you've even reached this arbitrary goal of B2, for example. So maybe you don't actually need B2. It's important to stay flexible when you're learning a language and to really take a moment to reflect every once in a while and just celebrate all the small successes along the way, no matter how small they may seem. Now, to wrap up this video, I'm going to go through the 8 most common misconceptions when it comes to language levels. Native speakers have C2. Okay, this is just not true. Someone who's learned a language as a small child, as a baby, it's not comparable to someone like us who are learning German or another language when we are no longer children and babies. This is not comparable. Accordingly, the next sentence is also incorrect. If I reach C2, I'm a native speaker. The highest level, C2, is defined by the Council of Europe as having a high level of appropriateness and ease of use of a language, and not by being native, which is hard to define to begin with. So, if you reach C2, you may be able to do all the things that native speakers can do, although you may do some of them slightly differently. But even way before C2, you'll already be able to chat with friends, write a novel, read a novel, and so much more. So you don't need to wait to have C2, and you don't need to have the goal of being native before you can reach any other goal you have. It's actually quite arbitrary. But even before that, you can research, you can work, you can live, laugh, love in a language before C2. I can't do anything before I have B2 or C1 or C2. You can do a lot before you reach B2. You'll even reach B2 faster if you start using the language in the real world much sooner. You can write letters, order in a cafe, read a novel. You can do almost anything you want. It'll just be slightly more difficult or slightly slower at B1 or pretty much as soon as possible. It may take longer, it may be more frustrating, but it's possible to live your life before you reach B2. C2 has to be the goal. I've already mentioned this. Your goal has to suit you and your needs. C2 is really demanding, and most language learners just aren't gonna need that level. If I speak a related language, then I can skip A1. You could try that, but I really wouldn't recommend it. There are so many important things that are taught and discussed at the A1 levels. And if you speak a related language, it may be true that this class or this course will be easier for you, or that you might be able to learn the information quicker in individual lessons or by learning by yourself, but that doesn't mean that you can just jump to A2. Pronunciation is not important at all for A1. I would not subscribe to that idea at all. Honestly, learning the writing system and how the writing system corresponds to specific sounds in a language is so important and is a big part of beginner language courses. So even if you already know the writing system, it's not going to correspond to the exact same sounds as in other languages. So it's true, you don't need to sound native in order to complete A1 or pass an A1 test, but you should be learning some pronunciation at that level. I have to get rid of my accent to count as C2. Now, accents are funny things. Some people are able to change their accents much easier than other people. And besides that, you can't get rid of an accent. You will always have an accent. German speakers from Germany have an accent. You can imitate the German accent. You can attempt to kind of mold your accent to sound more like the German accent, but that's still an accent. If I'm a beginner, then I'm A1. Well, if you're a complete beginner, then you're definitely not A1. You would be A0 if you really want to call yourself something. And even if you're not a complete beginner and you've already learned, it could still be that you've only reached half of what you need for A1. So maybe you're more of A1.1. Or it could even be that you have developed at different speeds in different domains. This could mean that you're more at the A2 level when it comes to reading, but when it comes to speaking, you haven't fulfilled all of the requirements for A1. This is actually quite normal, especially depending on what you spend your time on outside of class. If you spend a lot of time watching German movies and listening to German music, then your listening skills are going to develop quite quickly, whereas your speaking skills will likely lag behind. We all develop differently and may develop quicker or slower in different areas or at different times. That's just part of it. Whew, that was quite a lot of input. I know that, but I hope it was helpful for you. And if you're learning German, then I would definitely recommend you watch this video next. So, bis dann. Tschüss.